All right, welcome to lecture 1 of chapter 14. This section is going to focus on plants and fungi. So we are looking at just the eukaryotes. So chapter 15 covered the microbes, which are the other two domains, the bacteria and the archaeans, and then we also in that chapter talked about the protists, which are the eukaryotes as well. So we've already talked about a good number of eukaryotes. These are two of the other big branches of the eukaryotes. I'm also going to have you do a lab on the animals, which is the last major branch of the eukaryotes. So we're going to focus first here on the plants, because the plants are just one branch of the eukarya, but they are actually quite diverse. So let's first focus on what makes you a plant. What makes a plant a plant. And so there are 4 characteristics. One is one that we've already talked about, and that is that plants can make their own food. So plants have that ability to do photosynthesis, to take the energy from the sun and turn it along with carbon dioxide and water into sugar. And then the byproduct for us, oxygen. But the important part for them is that sugar. So plants can do photosynthesis to make their own food source. The second big characteristic is that plants are sessile, meaning that they are anchored in place. They can't move around. And this is different from the plant-like protists, because a lot of the plant-like protists actually have the ability to move. And the other big one is plants are terrestrial, so they are going to be found up on land. Think about all of the plants trees, grass, the flowering plants like lilies and so forth. These are all found up on soil, and even the plants that are found in water, like water lilies, have roots and they require soil. So they are still terrestrial in that way. Plants are also multicellular. This is another reason why a lot of the plant-like protists are in the protist group, because the plant-like protists are single-celled organisms a lot of times, and you have to be multicellular with specialized structures in order to be called a plant. The last big one is that you make your cell walls out of cellulose. This is actually one of the characteristics that helps distinguish plants from fungi, because fungi also make cell walls, but they do not use cellulose. So remember that molecule we saw before out of the carbohydrates of cellulose that we cannot digest? Well, this is what those plants are making to be able to make their cells nice and strong. So those are the 4 characteristics that make plants plants. Other things that we need to kind of just go over as far as plants go. So plants do make their own food, mostly. There are some exceptions. There are parasitic plants, and the ones that steal food from other plants. So mistletoe is actually a really good example of this. It's a parasitic plant that steals food from its host. But the ones that do make their own food, they also need some extra stuff. So if you remember from your experiment, I was putting fertilizer in the water that was in that big jug. It is going to contain things like nitrogen, phosphorus, and some salts. And that's because these are necessary for growth to be able to build things like DNA and proteins. So just getting sugar isn't enough. In order to actually grow, these items are going to be necessary for plants too. And so that's why we often put fertilizers on things like our houseplants, because these items are lacking in their soil that we have them planted in. The other thing that most plants have in common are these guys down here, roots and shoots. So roots, this one mostly makes sense to people. So if I was to draw a plant, the roots are going to be these guys. I know it's red. It always starts out red. So we've got roots, and the roots are going to be the section that are going to be underneath. Let's see. We'll make it black. Underneath the soil. All right, and that makes sense. So there are plants like orchids that don't need soil for their roots, but for most plants, their soil or their roots are going to be under the soil. So what are some functions of roots? And most people um, know that roots are used to bring up water. So they're used to draw water from the soil. Another thing that people don't think about, let me get myself up here out of the way, is that roots actually work as an anchor. So especially for uh, like big trees, this is especially true. But if you've ever tried to pull out like grass or a weed, these work really well to hold those plants into the soil. So the main functions of roots are to help provide water, but also to provide nutrients, because a lot of those nitrogen and phosphorus compounds and salts are going to be coming out of the soil. So that is the big set of functions for the roots, is to help pull in water, to anchor the plant, and to provide nutrients. Forgot the S. So then what are shoots? Basically, shoots are any part of the plant that are not roots. So let's see, let's get green. So that would be if we're looking at just like a flower. You've got the stem, we've got leaves, we've got another stem. So those are the parts that we normally think of. If this was a tree, the trunk and the branches would be part of the shoots. And if we're talking about something like a flower, the flower would also be part of the shoots, because all of this section of the plant is the shoot. So anything basically that's not a root is going to be considered a shoot. And so what are some of the functions of the shoots? Well, there's a lot of different functions. So if it's got flowers, one of the big ones is going to be reproduction. I'm going to just stop there. So reproduction, because that's what these are for producing seeds. Another one that is a big one is for photosynthesis. So I'm just going to shorthand PS for photosynthesis. This is also going to be a big part of the support for the plant, because think about like the branches and the trunk for like a tree. Those sections are going to help hold up the parts that do the photosynthesis. So very much a big separation between the roots and the shoots as far as what jobs they do, but they are linked together because the food from the shoot section is going to get fed to the roots, and the water and nutrients from the roots are going to get fed to the shoots. So being a plant can be tough because you're sessile, you're stuck. And so the three big things that are a problem for a plant who is stuck in one place is getting your food. Because if you think about it like an animal, I'm hungry, I'm gonna get up, I'm gonna walk around, and I'm gonna go find food. Plants unfortunately can't do that. So some of you noticed that your plants in your experiment were kind of like reaching towards the window, leaning over, right? With your leaves pointing towards the window. And that is actually part of their way to compensate for being able to not move. So they're actually bending to go towards the light. Another problem with being stationary, being stuck, is finding a way to reproduce. And so we'll see as we look at different plant groups, they all have different ways of figuring out how to find a mate to be able to reproduce, and then how to move your offspring. Because again, you're stuck in one place. How do you get the kids to move away from home? So we'll look at some of those mechanisms. And then the last one is if you are stuck, if you can't move, that means how do you get away from predators? And so there are lots of different ways to defend yourself. We'll talk about some of these as we get later into the chapter. Obviously, some of them are pretty straightforward. You make yourself all kinds of pokey. So this will deter, animals from trying to eat you if you are going to poke them back. So, all right, so who are the plants? Well, there are 4 major groups of plants, and these are the ones we're going to be looking at. We're going to take a look at their major characteristics, who are in these groups, and anything unusual about them. So the group that's down here at the base of the plant tree, so you can see here's their ancestor. It was most likely a protist. We've got non-vascular plants. We've got a good number of these. Then you go up and we've got another split where we've got vascular seedless plants. And we'll talk about what vascular means, but it is what you are probably thinking. They have a vascular system like we do. Our vascular system is our heart and our veins moving our blood around. Trees and other plants don't have hearts, but they do have the equivalent of veins and arteries. So these guys have them. Our non-vascular plants over here don't. Then we're going to talk about these other 2 groups because these 2 had a common ancestor a while back. These are the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. These guys, as you could look up here, if you say does the plant produce seeds, the vascular seedless plants don't. But these other 2 groups do. So we'll see what that does for those 2 groups when we get to them. So the first plants actually didn't have roots or seeds. So no roots. They have something that looks sort of like roots, but they're not true roots. And they didn't have any seeds either. And these first ones were the first ones to move up onto land. So if you think about their ancestors were from those plant-like protists. They all lived in the water, and there were lots of challenges from going from the water up onto the land. Now, this is what we think most likely the ancestor was similar to. This is a current day algae. This one lives on the edges of ponds. And it can withstand being exposed to air for periods of time. So when water levels in ponds fall down, when the pond dries out some, these guys can withstand being dried out for a period of time until the water comes back. Now, if they're dry for too long, they will die, but they can withstand periods of drying longer than other types of algae. So this actually helps out because if you think about it, obviously one of the big differences between being in the water and being up on land is drying out. There's not as much water. So there are 2 major problems with moving on to land. One is drying out, or what's called desiccation. The first plants that moved up on land didn't really actually have an adaptation for that. Basically, they stayed close to the water or stayed in areas that were going to be more damp. And we'll see that group here in a minute. Actually, we'll see that in our next lecture. But later plants got a wax layer on them. We call it a cuticle. Basically, it's the same idea as the wax on your car. It would allow the water to bubble up on the outside, but also keep the water on the inside. The other major problem was gravity, because if you think about it, if you float in a pool, you kind of feel a little weightless. Same thing for plants. So when they came up onto the land, they were being pulled down by gravity, which also means all of their materials were being pulled down, like their water and so forth. So the earliest plants were very small, like our first group, the non-vascular plants. And so that's how they dealt with gravity, and later groups actually adapted that vascular system we're going to talk about. So we'll start talking about some of the groups in our next lecture. So I'll see you in the next lecture.